Chapter 1. A Grim Summons. Inspector Archibald Price sat at his cluttered desk in the modest offices of Scotland Yard, the morning sun casting long shadows across the room. He was a man of middle years, with greying hair and sharp, intelligent eyes that had seen more than their fair share of the darkest corners of human nature. Just as Price was about to delve into the paperwork piled on his desk, there was a brisk knock at the door. His trusted assistant, Constable Henry Clark, entered, holding a sealed envelope. "Inspector, this just arrived for you, marked urgent," Clark said, handing over the letter. Price took the envelope, noting the expensive parchment and the elegant script that spelled out his name. Breaking the seal, he unfolded the letter and began to read. The letterhead bore the unmistakable crest of Thornfield Manor, an estate he had heard of but never visited. The letter was from Lady Margaret Pemrboke, the widow of Lord Alfred Pemrboke, a name that carried weight in certain circles of London society. The contents were brief, but laden with an urgency that Price could not ignore. "Inspector Price, I write to you in a state of profound distress. My husband, Lord Alfred Pemrboke, has been found dead under circumstances that defy simple explanation. I implore you to come to Thornfield Manor at once, for I fear that a great injustice has been done. The local authorities seem baffled, and I have every reason to believe that only a man of your reputation can bring clarity to this dreadful affair. Please come at once. Yours sincerely, Lady Margaret Pemrboke." Price set the letter down, his mind already working through the implications. Lord Alfred Pemrboke was a man of considerable wealth and influence, known for his philanthropy and connections in the upper echelons of society. A sudden, unexplained death in such a household was bound to be fraught with complications. "Clark," Price said, his voice steady, "prepare the carriage. We're going to Thornfield Manor." Clark nodded, recognizing the gravity in his superior's tone. "Right away, sir." As Clark hurried off, Price leaned back in his chair, contemplating the task ahead. He knew that Thornfield Manor was situated in the heart of the English countryside, a sprawling estate that had been in the Pembroke family for generations. The Pembrokes were an old, aristocratic family, their wealth and status ensuring that their affairs were usually kept well out of public view. For Lady Pemrboke to reach out to Scotland Yard, bypassing the local constabulary, suggested that the situation was dire indeed. The journey to Thornfield Manor took the better part of a day, the carriage winding through the verdant countryside, leaving behind the grime and noise of London. Price used the time to mentally prepare himself, considering what little he knew about the Pembroke family. Lord Alfred had married Lady Margaret, a woman much younger than himself, some years ago. Their marriage, while not exactly a love match, had appeared stable to the outside world. The family's wealth was vast, their influence far-reaching, but there were always whispers, rumours of discontent, of secrets buried deep within the walls of Thornfield Manor. As the carriage finally approached the manor, Price caught his first glimpse of the estate. Thornfield Manor was an imposing structure, its grey stone walls and towering turrets casting long shadows over the manicured gardens. The grandeur of the place was undeniable, but there was something else, a sense of isolation, as if the manor stood apart from the world, a place where the troubles of the outside could not easily penetrate. The carriage rolled to a stop at the front entrance, where a sombre-looking butler awaited them. As Price stepped out, the butler inclined his head respectfully. "Inspector Price, welcome to Thornfield Manor," the butler said in a low voice. "Lady Pemrboke is expecting you." Price nodded, his eyes scanning the grand facade of the manor. He followed the butler into the cavernous entry hall, where the cold stone floors echoed with each step. The walls were adorned with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, their eyes seeming to follow him as he walked by. Lady Margaret Pemrboke was waiting in the drawing-room, a spacious yet oppressively decorated chamber that spoke of old money and even older traditions. She rose as Price entered, her slender figure clad in black mourning attire. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed from weeping, but there was a steely resolve in her gaze that told Price she was a woman accustomed to maintaining composure in the face of tragedy. "Inspector Price, thank you for coming so quickly," Lady Margaret said, her voice trembling slightly as she extended her hand. Price took her hand briefly, noting the coldness of her skin. "My condolences on your loss, Lady Pembroke. I understand that the circumstances of your husband's death are unusual." Lady Margaret nodded, her expression pained. "Unusual is one way to put it, Inspector. The doctors say it was a heart attack, but I know Alfred was in perfect health. There's something they're not telling me, something they're too afraid to investigate." Price studied her for a moment. "And you believe your husband's death was not natural?" "I'm certain of it," she replied, her voice gaining strength. "Alfred was a strong man, Inspector. He had his faults, but he was not the kind to simply expire in his study without reason. There were no signs of illness, no warnings. And yet, here we are." Price nodded, taking in her words. "I'll need to see the scene, speak with those in the household." "Of course," Lady Margaret agreed, her composure faltering for a moment. "But, Inspector, I fear that the truth, whatever it may be, will not be easy to uncover. There are tensions in this house, old wounds that have never fully healed." Price raised an eyebrow. "Tensions?" She hesitated, then continued. "My husband's brother, Michael, arrived unannounced just a day before Alfred's death. Their relationship was strained, to say the least. And there are others in the household who may have had reason to wish Alfred ill." Price's interest was piqued. "I'll need to speak with them all. Rest assured, Lady Pembroke, I will get to the bottom of this." Lady Margaret nodded, her hands clasping together tightly. "Thank you, Inspector. I don't know what I would do without your help." As Price left the drawing room, guided by the butler towards the study where Lord Alfred had been found, he felt a familiar sensation settle over him. The weight of a case that promised to be anything but straightforward. Thornfield Manor, with its secrets and shadows, was a place where the truth would not easily reveal itself. But Inspector Price had faced such challenges before, and he was determined to unravel the mystery that had brought him to this isolated, troubled estate. The study was dimly lit, the heavy drapes drawn tightly against the afternoon sun. The room had been left untouched since Lord Alfred's body was discovered, a silent witness to whatever had transpired. Price took a moment to absorb the atmosphere, noting the cold hearth, the untouched glass of brandy on the desk, and the papers scattered as if abandoned in haste. It was here, in this room, that the answers lay hidden, and it was here that Price would begin his search for the truth.
Chapter 2. The Scene of the Crime. Inspector Price stood at the threshold of Lord Alfred Pembroke's study. The butler, Mr. Granger, hovered at his side, his face impassive, but his eyes betraying a hint of the anxiety that had gripped the household since the tragedy. "Has the room been disturbed since Lord Pembroke was found?" Price asked, his voice low but firm. "No, sir," Mr. Granger replied. "Lady Pembroke gave strict instructions that nothing was to be touched until your arrival." Price nodded in approval. As he stepped into the study, the heavy scent of leather-bound books and pipe tobacco filled his nostrils, but there was another smell beneath it, faint but unmistakable, the metallic tang of blood. The study was a large, imposing room with dark wood panelling and shelves that reached up to the high ceiling, filled with volumes that spoke to Lord Alfred's wide-ranging interests. A large mahogany desk dominated the centre of the room, its surface cluttered with papers, an inkpot and a quill pen that lay discarded as if the writer had been interrupted mid-thought. On one side of the room, a tall window, its drapes half-drawn, allowed a sliver of light to spill across the polished floor. Price's gaze moved to the leather armchair behind the desk, where Lord Alfred's body had been found. The chair was slightly askew, and a dark stain marred the rich leather. Price approached slowly, his eyes scanning every detail. The chair was now empty, of course. Lord Alfred's body had been removed to the family crypt, where it awaited further examination, but the evidence of violence remained. The stain on the chair was dried blood, a stark contrast against the deep brown leather. Price knelt to examine it more closely. The blood had pooled around the lower back of the chair, suggesting that the wound had been inflicted from behind. The position of the stain indicated that Lord Alfred had been seated when he was struck. "Mr. Granger," Price called without looking up. "Who found the body?" The butler, who had been standing quietly near the door, stepped forward. "It was Mrs. Hawkins, the housekeeper, sir. She came to bring Lord Pembroke his tea, as was her custom every afternoon. When he didn't answer her knock, she entered the room and found him slumped over the desk." "Did she notice anything unusual when she entered?" Price asked. "She mentioned that the window was open, sir," Granger replied. "She found it odd, as Lord Pembroke always preferred the room to be closed up when he was working." Price glanced at the window. It was currently closed, but the latch appeared to be loose, as if it had been opened and shut multiple times in quick succession. He made a mental note to inspect it more closely later. "Was anything taken from the room?" Price inquired, rising to his feet. Granger shook his head. "Not to our knowledge, sir. Everything appears to be in order, though Lady Pembroke mentioned that a letter Lord Alfred had been writing was missing." Price raised an eyebrow. "A letter?" "Yes, sir. Lady Pembroke was aware of its existence because Lord Pembroke had mentioned it to her earlier in the day. He said it was an important letter, though he didn't specify to whom it was addressed. A missing letter could mean many things: a lost document, a crucial piece of evidence, or perhaps a motive for murder. But without knowing its contents, the inspector could only speculate." "Where is Mrs. Hawkins now?" Price asked, turning his attention back to the butler. "She's in her quarters, sir. She's been deeply affected by the incident. Lady Pembroke thought it best that she rest for a while." "I'll need to speak with her soon," Price said, his tone making it clear that it was not a request. "For now, I'd like to examine the rest of the room." Price began a methodical sweep of the study, starting with the desk. The papers scattered across its surface were mostly correspondence and financial documents, nothing out of the ordinary for a man of Lord Alfred's standing. However, one document caught his eye. A letter, partially written, the ink still legible despite the time that had passed. It was addressed to a solicitor in London, discussing an amendment to Lord Alfred's will. Price read the letter carefully. The amendment mentioned a change in the distribution of assets, specifically an increase in the allowance for Lady Margaret and a reduction in the inheritance left to Lord Alfred's brother Michael. The letter was unfinished, as if Lord Alfred had been interrupted while writing it. Price tucked the letter into his coat pocket. It was a small but significant clue, a potential motive, perhaps, or at the very least a glimpse into the tensions within the family. He would need to learn more about the relationship between Lord Alfred and his brother, and why such a change in the will had been necessary. Next, Price moved to the window. He unlatched it and pushed it open, peering out into the expansive gardens below. The window overlooked a secluded section of the grounds, where dense shrubbery and tall trees created a natural barrier from the rest of the estate. It was a perfect place for someone to approach the house unnoticed. "Was the window open when Mrs. Hawkins found the body?" Price asked, turning back to Granger. "Yes, sir," Granger confirmed. "She mentioned that she closed it after discovering Lord Pembroke, thinking it strange that it had been left open." Price nodded. The open window was suspicious, especially in a household as meticulously maintained as Thornfield Manor. It suggested that someone might have entered or exited the room in a hurry. After closing the window, Price turned his attention to the fireplace. It was cold, the ashes undisturbed, indicating that it hadn't been used recently. However, something on the hearth caught his eye. A small, crumpled piece of paper, partially burned. He carefully retrieved the fragment and smoothed it out. The writing was nearly illegible, but he could make out a few words. "Too late," and "must act." The rest had been consumed by flames. Price frowned. The paper seemed to have been deliberately burned, possibly to destroy evidence. But if so, why had it been left in such an obvious place? It was as if the perpetrator had been interrupted, forced to abandon their task before it was completed. As he stood, lost in thought, the door to the study creaked open. Lady Margaret entered, her face drawn with fatigue but her posture still dignified. She looked at Price with an expression that was equal parts hope and fear. "Inspector, have you found anything?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Price met her gaze, weighing his words carefully. "I've found some things that are of interest, Lady Pembroke, but it's too early to draw any conclusions. I'll need to speak with everyone in the household, including you, if you're up to it." Lady Margaret nodded, her eyes dark with resolve. "I'll answer any questions you have, Inspector. I just want to know the truth." Price gave a slight nod. "We'll begin with your account shortly. In the meantime, I'd like to see where Lord Pembroke's body was taken." Lady Margaret hesitated, then gestured for the butler to lead the way. As Price followed Mr. Granger out of the study and down the long, shadowed corridors of Thornfield Manor, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that the very walls of the manor were closing in on him, eager to keep their secrets buried. Chapter 3. The Widow's Lament. Inspector Price sat across from Lady Margaret Pembroke in the dimly lit drawing-room, steeped in an oppressive silence, broken only by the distant ticking of a grandfather clock that seemed to mark the passage of time with a sense of inexorable doom. Lady Margaret, dressed in the sombre black of mourning, sat rigidly in her high-backed chair, her pale hands clasped tightly in her lap. Despite her composed exterior, Price could see the telltale signs of grief etched on her face, the faint tremor in her hands, the dark circles under her eyes, and the barely restrained emotion in her voice. She had been the picture of decorum since his arrival, but now, under the scrutiny of the inspector, her carefully maintained facade showed signs of cracking. "Thank you for speaking with me, Lady Pembroke," Price began, his tone gentle but firm. "I know this is a difficult time for you, but it's important that we understand everything that led up to your husband's death." Lady Margaret nodded slowly, her eyes downcast. "I understand, Inspector. Please, ask what you must." Price took a deep breath. "Can you tell me about Lord Alfred's state of mind in the days leading up to his death?" Lady Margaret looked up, her eyes reflecting a deep sadness. "Alfred had been troubled, Inspector. More so than usual. He was a man prone to brooding, but in the last few weeks it seemed as though something was weighing heavily on him. He became distant, preoccupied with matters he wouldn't discuss with me." "Did he ever mention what was troubling him?" Price asked. Lady Margaret hesitated, as if searching her memory for any detail that might help. "He spoke in vague terms, about decisions he had to make, and about the future of the family. He seemed particularly concerned about his brother Michael." "Michael Pembroke," Price echoed, recalling the mention of the estranged brother in their earlier conversation. "What can you tell me about their relationship?" Lady Margaret sighed, her expression weary. "It was strained, to say the least. Alfred and Michael were close once, but that was many years ago. They had a falling out over matters of inheritance and family responsibilities. Michael felt that he had been wronged, that Alfred had taken more than his fair share of the family's wealth. They hadn't spoken in years, and then, out of the blue, Michael arrived at Thornfield just a day before Alfred's death." "Did their meeting go well?" Price asked, noting the timing of Michael's arrival. Lady Margaret shook her head, her lips pressed into a thin line. "No, Inspector, it was a disaster. Alfred was furious that Michael had shown up uninvited. They argued bitterly, and it ended with Alfred ordering Michael to leave the estate. But Michael refused to go. He said he had unfinished business with Alfred." "Unfinished business?" Price repeated, his interest piqued. Did he elaborate on what he meant? "No," Lady Margaret replied, her voice faltering slightly. "He was very cryptic about it. But I could see that whatever it was, it had shaken Alfred deeply. He barely spoke to me after their confrontation. He spent most of the day locked away in his study writing that letter you found." "The letter to his solicitor?" Price asked, taking out the unfinished document from his coat pocket. "Yes," she confirmed, her eyes lingering on the letter as if it were a ghost from the past. "He told me he was making changes to his will. He didn't say what the changes were, but I could tell it was something significant. Something he felt he had to do immediately." Price nodded, understanding that the letter was likely connected to whatever had transpired between the brothers. "Lady Pembrooke," Price said gently, "I need to ask you about your own relationship with Lord Alfred. I know this is a sensitive subject, but it's important for me to understand everything that might have influenced his state of mind." Lady Margaret's face tightened, her hands gripping the armrests of her chair, as if bracing herself for what was to come. "Alfred and we were not what one might call a love match, Inspector. Our marriage was one of convenience, arranged by our families. We had our moments of affection, but they were few and far between. In recent years, we had grown apart." Price noted the bitterness in her voice, the undercurrent of resentment that suggested there was more to her story than she was letting on. "Did you ever discuss separating or perhaps seeking a divorce?" Lady Margaret looked away, her gaze fixed on the ornate rug beneath her feet. "We discussed it once, but Alfred was adamant that a divorce was out of the question. He said it would bring shame upon the family, that it was better for us to remain married in name, even if our hearts were elsewhere." "Was your heart elsewhere, Lady Pembroke?" Price asked carefully, his tone non-judgmental. She turned back to him, her eyes blazing with a sudden intensity. "Is that an accusation, Inspector?" "Not at all," Price replied calmly. "I'm simply trying to understand the dynamics within the household. Any tension, any emotional strain, could be relevant to the investigation." Lady Margaret's anger seemed to dissipate as quickly as it had flared, leaving behind a weary resignation. "There was someone else," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it was nothing more than a fleeting infatuation, a foolish fancy that I quickly realized would lead to nothing but heartache. I ended it before it could become anything more." Price regarded her thoughtfully. "Did Lord Alfred know?" Lady Margaret nodded slowly. "He knew. I didn't try to hide it from him. But he didn't seem to care. By that point, our marriage had become a hollow shell, an arrangement in name only. We lived separate lives under the same roof." Price took in her words, sensing the deep well of pain that lay beneath them. It was clear that the marriage had been far from happy, and that both Lord Alfred and Lady Margaret had harboured their own secrets and regrets. But was that enough to drive someone to murder? Or was there something more, something hidden beneath the surface, that he had yet to uncover? "Thank you for your honesty, Lady Pembroke," Price said after a moment. "I know this isn't easy for you." She gave a slight nod, her expression one of exhaustion. "I just want to know the truth, Inspector, whatever it may be. And I promise you I will do everything in my power to find it," Price assured her. "But I need to ask you one more thing. Did you notice anything unusual in the days leading up to Lord Alfred's death? Anything out of the ordinary, no matter how small it might seem?" Lady Margaret seemed to consider this for a moment, her brow furrowing in thought. "There was something. On the night before Alfred died, I woke up in the middle of the night and heard voices coming from his study. At first I thought he was speaking with Michael again, but when I listened more closely I realised it wasn't him. It was a woman's voice." "A woman?" Price repeated, his curiosity piqued. "Who could it have been?" "I don't know," Lady Margaret admitted, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "It wasn't any of the household staff, I'm sure of that. And it wasn't me. I was too afraid to confront them, so I went back to bed and tried to put it out of my mind. But now you think it might be connected to his death," Price finished for her. Lady Margaret nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and regret. "I can't help but wonder if I should have done something, if I should have stopped it. But I was too afraid, too unsure of what I heard." Price leaned back in his chair, his mind working through the possibilities. The presence of an unknown woman in Lord Alfred's study on the night before his death was a significant detail, one that could point to a hidden aspect of his life. perhaps an affair, or some other secret that had led to his untimely demise. "Lady Pembroke, I'll need to investigate this further," Price said, his tone firm. "But rest assured, I will leave no stone unturned in my search for the truth." Lady Margaret gave him a weak smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Thank you, Inspector. I appreciate your diligence." As Price stood to leave, Lady Margaret reached out and touched his arm, stopping him in his tracks. "Inspector," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly, "I loved Alfred in my own way. Despite everything, I never wanted this to happen. I hope you believe that." Price looked down at her, seeing the sincerity in her eyes. "I believe you, Lady Pembroke, and I'll find out who's responsible for his death." Chapter 4. A House Divided. Price had spent the day interviewing the household staff and family members, piecing together a fragmented narrative of the days leading up to Lord Alfred Pembroke's death. Yet the more he learned, the more elusive the truth became. Price knew that the key to solving this mystery lay not just in the events of the past few days, but in the complex relationships within the household. As he prepared to speak with Michael Pembroke, Lord Alfred's estranged brother, he couldn't shake the feeling that this conversation would be pivotal. Mr. Granger, the butler, had informed Price that Michael was waiting for him in the library, a room that, like so many others in Thornfield, was steeped in history and grandeur. As Price made his way through the maze of corridors, he reflected on what Lady Margaret had told him about the brothers' strained relationship. The fact that Michael had arrived at Thornfield so suddenly, just a day before Alfred's death, was a red flag that couldn't be ignored. The library was a stately room with a large fireplace that dominated one wall, its mantel adorned with family portraits and mementos. Michael Pembroke stood by one of the tall windows, staring out at the manicured gardens beyond, a glass of brandy in his hand. Michael turned as Price entered the room, his expression unreadable. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered and powerfully built, with the same aristocratic features as his late brother, though there was a roughness about him that spoke of a life lived outside the genteel confines of Thornfield Manor. His dark hair was flecked with grey, and his eyes, a piercing blue, seemed to scrutinise Price with an intensity that was almost unsettling. "Inspector Price," Michael said, his voice deep and gravelly. "I was wondering when you'd get around to questioning me." Price inclined his head in greeting. "Mr. Pembroke, thank you for agreeing to speak with me. I'm sure you understand that I need to cover all angles in this investigation." Michael gave a wry smile. "Of course. It's not every day that a man's brother is found murdered in his own home." Price didn't respond to the provocation, instead gestured to the armchairs by the fireplace. Michael nodded and moved to one of the chairs, sitting down with a deliberate casualness that Price recognised as a mask. The man was on guard, every movement calculated. Price took the chair opposite him, studying Michael as he settled in. "I'd like to start by asking about your relationship with your brother, Lord Alfred. Lady Margaret mentioned that you hadn't spoken in years before your arrival at Thornfield. What prompted you to visit now?" Michael swirled the brandy in his glass, his gaze fixed on the amber liquid as if it held the answers to life's mysteries. "I'm sure Margaret gave you the broad strokes. An inheritance dispute, a falling out, all that family drama. But there's more to it than that, Inspector. Alfred and I were once very close, but as we grew older, our paths diverged. He chose the life of a country gentleman, managing the estate, while I sought my fortunes elsewhere." "And where exactly did you seek those fortunes?" Price asked, his tone neutral. Michael looked up, his expression hardening. "The colonies, Inspector. I spent years in India, then Africa. Made a name for myself, for better or worse. But that's beside the point. I came back because I'd heard rumours that Alfred was making changes to his will, and I wanted to know why." Price leaned forward slightly. "And did you find out?" Michael's lips twitched in a faint smile. "Not directly. Alfred was always tight-lipped about his affairs, but I knew him well enough to sense that he was troubled. There was something weighing on him, something he wasn't ready to share." Lady Margaret mentioned that you and your brother had a heated argument the day you arrived, Price said, watching Michael closely. Can you tell me what it was about? Michael's smile faded, replaced by a look of irritation. It was about the will, of course. Alfred didn't appreciate me meddling in his business, and I didn't appreciate being left in the dark. We exchanged some harsh words and he ordered me to leave, but I wasn't going anywhere, not until I got some answers. And did you? Price asked. Michael shook his head, his expression darkening. No. Alfred stormed off to his study, and I didn't see him again until the next day when I was told he was dead. Price considered Michael's words carefully. The story he told was plausible enough, but there was a coldness in his demeanour, a detachment that set Price's instincts on edge. He decided to probe further. What was your relationship with Lady Margaret like? Price asked, shifting the focus slightly. Michael's eyes narrowed, a flicker of something, resentment, passing across his face. Margaret and I have always been civil, but we were never close. She's a practical woman, very different from Alfred in that regard. I respected her, but we didn't see much of each other. Did you notice anything unusual about her behaviour the day prior to your brother's death? Price pressed. Michael frowned as if considering the question. She seemed tense. But then again, we all were. There was a lot of strain in the air, and Margaret was doing her best to keep the household running smoothly. I can't say I noticed anything out of the ordinary, though. Price noted the ambiguity in Michael's response. Mr. Pembroke, I need to ask you directly. Where were you on the night your brother was killed? Michael's expression hardened, and for a moment Price thought he might refuse to answer. But then Michael let out a slow breath, his shoulders relaxing slightly. I was in my room, he said. I didn't leave the East Wing after our argument. I was in no mood for company, and I didn't want to see Alfred again that night. Can anyone confirm that? Price asked, his voice calm but insistent. Michael's jaw tightened. No. I was alone, Inspector. If you're implying that I had something to do with Alfred's death, you're barking up the wrong tree. I'm not implying anything, Mr. Pembroke, Price replied evenly. I'm simply trying to establish the facts. Michael stared at him for a long moment, his eyes cold and calculating. Is that all, Inspector? For now, Price said, standing up. But I may have more questions later. Michael rose as well, his expression guarded. I'll be here if you need me. As Price turned to leave, he paused at the door, looking back at Michael. One last thing. Did you hear anything unusual the night your brother died? Any strange noises, voices, anything out of place? Michael hesitated, his eyes narrowing slightly. Now that you mention it, I did hear something. A woman's voice, coming from Alfred's study. It was late, past midnight, I'd say. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now... Price's pulse quickened. This was the second time he had heard about an unknown woman in Lord Alfred's study on the night of his death. Did you recognize the voice? Michael shook his head, his expression thoughtful. No, it was too faint. But it didn't sound like anyone in the household. Price nodded, his mind racing. The mystery woman was becoming a central figure in the investigation, and he needed to find out who she was and what role she had played in Lord Alfred's death. Thank you, Mr. Pembroke, Price said. If you remember anything else, no matter how small, please let me know. Michael gave a curt nod, and Price left the library, his thoughts a whirlwind of possibilities. Price's next stop was the East Wing, where Michael claimed to have spent the night of his brother's murder. The East Wing was rarely used, a part of the manor that had been left to gather dust as the family's fortunes waned. It was a place of faded glory, its once grand rooms now empty and echoing with memories of a bygone era. As Price walked through the dimly lit corridors, he felt a chill in the air. The rooms were cold, their furniture covered in white sheets that gave them the appearance of ghosts, haunting the manor with their silent presence. Price stopped and opened the door to Michael's room. The room was sparsely furnished, with a simple bed, a wardrobe, and a small writing desk by the window. There was nothing out of place, nothing to suggest that this room had been the scene of anything unusual. Price walked over to the window, looking out at the darkened landscape beyond. The gardens, once meticulously maintained, were now overgrown and wild. As he stood there, lost in thought, Price heard a faint creak behind him. He turned quickly, his hand instinctively going to the revolver at his side. But there was no one there, only the empty room, silent and still. Leaving the east wing, Price made his way back to the main part of the house, his mind racing with questions. Who was the woman in Lord Alfred's study? What had she been doing there? And why had her presence been kept a secret? And most importantly, was she connected to the murder? Or was she just another piece of the puzzle, one that had yet to reveal its true significance? Chapter 5. Shadows in the Study. The events of the previous day had left Price with more questions than answers, and today his first destination was Lord Alfred's study, the place where the victim had been found. Despite having visited it briefly when he first arrived, he knew that a more thorough examination was needed. The study was located in the west wing, a room steeped in the heavy scent of old books and cigar smoke. The walls were lined with shelves crammed with legal volumes. The large mahogany desk in the centre of the room was where Price's attention was focused, its surface still cluttered with documents, quills, and an inkstand. He began by examining the desk, noting the careful organisation of the papers. Alfred had clearly been a man who valued order, but there was something off about the scene. The desk was too neat, too composed, as if someone had tidied up after the fact. Price's gaze was drawn to the partially written letter to the solicitor that he had found the previous day. The letter, though unfinished, hinted at a significant change to Lord Alfred's will, a change that could have far-reaching consequences for those around him. Price carefully unfolded the letter once more, reading through the lines, hoping to glean some insight into Alfred's state of mind. And so it is with a heavy heart that I must make these changes, for the future of Thornfield and the legacy of our family depend upon it. I cannot allow— The letter trailed off, the ink blotched as if Alfred had been interrupted or had hesitated before continuing. Price frowned, wondering what had caused Alfred to stop writing. Price set the letter aside and turned his attention to the rest of the desk. There was a small wooden box in one corner, its lid slightly ajar. Inside, he found a collection of correspondence when one letter caught his eye. It was addressed to Lord Alfred, written in a delicate feminine hand. The paper was of high quality, the kind used by those of wealth and status. The letter was unsigned, but the tone was unmistakably personal. Dearest Alfred, I write to you with a heart full of sorrow, for I fear that our time together may soon come to an end. The circumstances that bind us have become too perilous, and I cannot bear the thought of bringing shame upon your name or mine. You have always been a man of honour, and I know that you will do what is right for your family and Thornfield. But I beg of you, do not forget the moments we shared, for they will remain with me always, yours, forever in spirit. Could this have been the woman Lady Margaret and Michael had heard in the study on the night of the murder? Price wondered. No. He carefully folded the letter and placed it in his pocket. He would need to follow up on this lead, but for now there were other matters to attend to. He continued his search, moving to the bookshelves that lined the room. He scanned the titles, noting the eclectic mix of legal texts, but one book in particular caught his eye, a small leather-bound volume tucked away in a corner of the shelf, its spine unmarked. Price pulled the book from the shelf and opened it, revealing a hidden compartment within. Inside the compartment was a single, folded sheet of paper, yellowed with age. Price unfolded the paper carefully. It was another letter, this one written by Lord Alfred himself. To whom it may concern, the letter began, the tone formal and distant. In the event of my untimely death, I leave this letter as a record of my final thoughts and actions. I have made changes to my will, changes that I believe are necessary to secure the future of Thornfield and my family. I know that these decisions may cause pain to those I leave behind, but I can only hope that they will understand my reasons in time. There are matters that I have kept hidden, secrets that I have carried with me for many years. Some of these secrets I will take to the grave, but others must be revealed if justice is to be done. Price felt his heart quicken as he read the words. This was no ordinary letter. It was a confession of sorts, though its full meaning was unclear. The mention of secrets and the reference to justice suggested that Lord Alfred had something deeply troubling him in his final days. The letter continued, but just as it seemed to be building to a revelation, it abruptly ended, the last few lines smudged and illegible. He placed the letter alongside the first, his mind racing with possibilities. Who had Alfred been writing to? What were these secrets that he had alluded to? And most importantly, how were they connected to his death? He suddenly heard a soft knock at the door and quickly folded the letters away in his coat pocket before calling out, "Come in." The door opened and Mr. Granger, the butler, stepped inside. "Inspector Price, I thought you might wish to know that Miss Emily Pembrooke has returned to the manor. She's in the drawing room." Price nodded. Miss Emily Pembroke, Lord Alfred's only daughter, had been away from Thornfield when her father was killed. Her return had been delayed due to the poor weather, but now that she was here, Price was eager to speak with her. Emily's perspective on her father and the family dynamics could be invaluable. "Thank you, Mr. Granger," Price said, standing up. "I'll speak with her at once." The drawing room was a bright, airy space, a stark contrast to the dark and brooding study. The walls were adorned with famous portraits. Emily Pembroke stood by the window. She was a young woman in her early 20s, with the same striking features as her father: dark hair, fair skin, and an air of quiet dignity. Price paused for a moment, observing her. Emily was dressed in a simple black gown, her mourning attire elegant yet understated. She turned her eyes, meeting his with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "Miss Pembroke," Price greeted her with a slight bow. "My condolences on your loss. I'm Inspector Price, here to investigate your father's death." "Thank you, Inspector," Emily replied, her voice soft but steady. "It's all been such a shock. I still can't believe he's gone." "I understand this is a difficult time for you," Price said gently, "but I need to ask you some questions about your father and the days leading up to his death. Anything you can tell me might be helpful." Emily nodded, moving to sit on one of the upholstered chairs by the fireplace. Price took the seat opposite her, studying her closely. Despite her composed exterior, he could see the strain in her eyes, the grief that she was trying so hard to keep under control. "So, Miss Pembroke, can you tell me about your relationship with your father?" Price began, his tone sympathetic. Emily took a deep breath before answering. "Father and I were close, Inspector. He was a stern man, but he always had my best interests at heart." "Did he ever share any concerns with you?" Price asked. "Anything that might have been troubling him in recent weeks?" Emily hesitated, her brow furrowing as she considered the question. "He did seem more preoccupied than usual lately, but he didn't confide in me. Father was a private man, and he didn't talk much, but I could tell that something was on his mind." "Did he mention anything about changing his will?" Price asked, watching her reaction closely. Emily's eyes widened slightly. "He did, actually. He mentioned it in passing a few weeks ago, but he didn't go into detail. I assumed it was just a routine update, something to do with the estate." "Miss Pembroke," Price said, changing tack slightly, "did you know of anyone who might have had reason to harm your father? Anyone with a grudge or a motive?" Emily looked down at her hands, her expression pained. I don't know, Inspector. Father was a respected man, but he wasn't without enemies. But I can't imagine anyone would go so far as to kill him." Price leaned forward slightly. "What about within the family? Was there any tension, any disagreements that might have escalated?" Emily's face paled, and for a moment, Price thought she might refuse to answer. But then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "There were always disagreements, Inspector. Father and Uncle Michael, they were never on good terms. And Lady Margaret. She and father had their differences too. But it was nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing that would lead to this. Price studied her closely. Here was more to this story. He was sure of it. But Emily was holding back. But why? Miss Pembroke, Price said softly, if there's anything you're not telling me, anything at all, now is the time to speak. Emily looked up at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. For a long moment she seemed to wrestle with herself, but in the end, she simply shook her head, her voice barely audible. I'm sorry, Inspector. I don't know anything more. Price felt a pang of frustration, but he knew better than to press her further. Thank you for your time, miss, he said. If you remember anything else, anything at all, please don't hesitate to contact me. Chapter 6. The Unravelling Threads. Price was investigating in the library, thinking how Lord Alfred had spent many hours here, and it was said that the library was where he came to think, to plan, and perhaps even to conceal his most guarded secrets. As Price scanned the shelves, he wondered how many of those secrets had been hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone perceptive enough to uncover them. The letter he had found in Lord Alfred's study had hinted at a man burdened by guilt and aware of looming danger, but the nature of those secrets was still elusive. Price moved to the large oak desk that dominated the centre of the room. It was a formidable piece of furniture, scarred by years of use. The surface was cluttered with stacks of books, loose papers, and a few personal effects. A silver pocket watch, a pair of reading glasses, and a photograph of Lord Alfred as a younger man, standing proudly with a woman and a little girl, presumably Lady Margaret and Emily. Price turned his attention to the papers scattered across the desk. Most of them were financial documents and estate records, mundane in their details. But as Price sifted through them, he found something that caught his eye. A small leather-bound notebook, its cover worn and cracked with age. The notebook was unmarked, but when Price opened it, he immediately recognised Lord Alfred's neat, precise handwriting. The pages were filled with notes and observations, written in a style that suggested they were meant for Alfred's eyes only. Price flipped through the pages, reading passages that ranged from estate matters to personal reflections, until he came to a section that made him pause. February 12th. The situation grows more dire by the day. I fear I have made enemies where I once had friends. The weight of what I have done presses on me, and yet I see no way out. I must protect my family, but at what cost? The changes to the will are necessary, but I know they will bring pain. I must be strong, for all our sakes. Price's brow furrowed as he read the entry. It was clear that Lord Alfred had been under immense pressure, but the details were frustratingly vague. What had he done that caused him such anguish? And who were these enemies he referred to? Price continued reading, searching for any further clues, but the entries that followed were more of the same. But then, near the end of the notebook, Price found something interesting. It was a single line, written hastily and underlined twice, as if to emphasize its importance. Beware the one who watches from the shadows. Price stared at the words. The warning was cryptic, but it suggested that Alfred had been aware of a threat, someone lurking in the background, watching and waiting. As Price pondered the significance of the warning, he heard a soft creak behind him. He turned quickly, his hand instinctively going to the revolver at his side. But there was no one there, only the empty room, silent and still. Price shook his head, chiding himself for his nerves. The house was playing tricks on him, its eerie atmosphere getting under his skin. Leaving the library, Price decided it was time to speak with the other members of the household. His conversation with Emily had yielded some useful information, but there were still others who might have insights into the events leading up to Lord Alfred's death, and he knew exactly where he wanted to start. Price made his way to the servants' quarters, the area of the house that was most removed from the grandeur and opulence of the rest of Thornfield. The corridors here were narrow and dimly lit, the walls plain and unadorned. Price had always believed that the servants of a household often knew more about their employers than they were given credit for. They saw everything, heard everything, and often had their own ways of piecing together the truth. He found Mrs. Hudson, the housekeeper, in the small office she maintained near the kitchen. She was a stout woman with a no-nonsense demeanour, her grey hair pulled back into a severe bun. She looked up as Price entered, her expression wary. "Inspector," she greeted him curtly. "What can I do for you?" "I need to ask you a few questions about Lord Alfred," Price said, taking a seat across from her, "and about the events leading up to his death." Mrs. Hudson pursed her lips, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I've already told the other officers everything I know. I don't see how I can be of any more help." Price leaned forward, his tone gentle but insistent. "I'm sure you've been very thorough, Mrs. Hudson, but sometimes the smallest details can make all the difference. I need to know if you noticed anything unusual in the days before Lord Alfred was killed. Anything out of the ordinary, no matter how insignificant it might seem." The housekeeper hesitated, her gaze shifting to the window as if she were considering her words carefully. Finally, she sighed and turned back to Price. "There was something," she admitted. "A few days before it happened, I found Mr. Michael and Lord Alfred arguing in the study. I didn't hear all of it, but they were shouting at each other. I've seen them disagree before, but this was different. It was vicious." Price's interest was piqued. "Did you hear what they were arguing about?" Mrs. Hudson shook her head. "Not much, just bits and pieces. Something about the estate, about what would happen after Lord Alfred was gone. Mr. Michael was furious, said something about not being cheated out of what was rightfully his. But Lord Alfred just kept saying that it was too late, that things had already been set in motion." "Did anyone else witness this argument?" Price asked. "No, sir," Mrs. Hudson replied. "Just me, and I didn't stick around to listen in. It wasn't my place." Price nodded, filing away the information. The argument between Alfred and Michael was significant, especially in light of what he had learned about the changes to the will. Could Michael have been the one to watch from the shadows? "One more thing, Mrs. Hudson," Price said. "Did you ever see a woman here in the days before Lord Alfred's death? Someone who wasn't part of the household?" The housekeeper frowned, her brow furrowing in thought. "No, I can't say that I did, but—" She hesitated, her gaze flicking towards the door as if to ensure they were alone. "There was a letter. It came a day before Lord Alfred died. I didn't recognise the handwriting, and there was no return address. I gave it to Lord Alfred myself. He seemed unsettled after he read it, but he didn't say anything to me about it." "Do you know what happened to the letter?" Price asked, leaning forward slightly. Mrs. Hudson shook her head. "No, sir. Lord Alfred was very private about his correspondence. If he kept it, it would be in his study or his personal quarters." Price thanked Mrs. Hudson for her time and left the servants' quarters, his mind racing with the new information. He quickened his pace, making his way to Lord Alfred's personal quarters. The late Lord's private rooms were located in the East Wing, a section of the house that had remained largely undisturbed since his death. As Price entered the master bedroom, he was struck by the coldness of the room. The room was grand, with a four-poster bed draped in heavy curtains, a large fireplace, and a wardrobe that stood open, revealing a collection of finely tailored suits. But it was the writing desk in the corner that drew Price's attention. He crossed the room and sat down at the desk, his eyes scanning the surface for anything that might be out of place. The desk was tidy, but not excessively so. There were a few papers, a quill and an inkwell, but nothing that immediately caught his eye. Price began opening the drawers, methodically searching through their contents. Most of what he found was mundane: stationery, a few books, and a small box containing cufflinks and other personal effects. But in the bottom drawer, hidden beneath a stack of old letters, Price found something. It was the letter Mrs. Hudson had mentioned, the one that had arrived the day before Lord Alfred's death. The envelope was unmarked, just as she had said, and the seal had been broken. Price carefully unfolded the letter, his eyes scanning the text. The handwriting was elegant, almost too perfect, and the message was brief. The sins of the past are never truly forgotten. You know what you must do. The consequences of inaction will be dire. There was no signature, no indication of who had sent the letter. But the tone was ominous, the threat clear. This was no ordinary letter. This was a warning, a final ultimatum that had clearly weighed heavily on Lord Alfred's mind. He folded the letter and placed it carefully in his pocket. As he left the master bedroom, he knew that the investigation was reaching a critical point. Chapter 7. Unmasking Deceit. As the evening drew near, Price decided it was time to confront one of the suspects directly. Michael Pembroke had been an elusive figure throughout the investigation, offering only the bare minimum of cooperation. Price had found Michael's manner evasive, and now, with the revelations from Mrs. Hudson and the discovery of the ominous letter, it was clear that Michael knew more than he was letting on. Price found Michael in the drawing room, seated in an armchair by the fire, a glass of brandy in his hand. Michael looked up as Price entered. "Inspector," Michael greeted him coolly. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Price took a seat across from Michael, his eyes fixed on the man's face. "I thought it was time we had a more candid discussion, Mr. Pembroke. There are some matters that require further clarification." Michael took a sip of his brandy, his gaze steady. "I see. And what might those matters be?" Price didn't waste any time. "I understand you had an argument with your brother shortly before his death. It was overheard by one of the servants." Michael's expression darkened slightly. "Yes, we had a disagreement. It was nothing out of the ordinary for us, Inspector. Alfred and I often clashed on matters concerning the estate." "This disagreement was about the estate?" Price pressed. "It was," Michael admitted, setting his glass down. "Alfred was always stubborn, unwilling to listen to reason. He had certain ideas about how things should be run, and they didn't always align with mine." "The servant mentioned that you were particularly upset during this argument," Price said. "You accused your brother of cheating you out of what was rightfully yours." Michael's eyes narrowed, a flash of irritation crossing his face. "It's true that I was angry, Inspector. Alfred had made some decisions that I didn't agree with, decisions that would have affected my future and that of my family. But that doesn't mean I wanted him dead."
"Yet you were aware that your brother was planning to change his will," Price said. "Did he ever confide in you about those changes?"
Michael shook his head. "No, he didn't. Alfred was always secretive about his affairs, especially when it came to the will. But you suspected that the changes he was planning would not be in your favour," Price suggested. Michael's jaw tightened, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. "It crossed my mind, yes. Alfred had always favoured Emily, and I wouldn't have been surprised if he intended to leave the bulk of the estate to her." Price studied Michael's face, searching for any sign of deception. There was a hardness in Michael's eyes, a bitterness that spoke of long-standing resentment. But whether that resentment had driven him to murder was another question. "Mr. Pembroke," Price said slowly, "I need to ask you about a letter that was delivered to your brother the day before his death. It was unsigned, but it contained a very clear threat." Michael's expression remained neutral, but Price noticed a slight tensing of his shoulders. "I don't know anything about a letter, Inspector." "But you were aware that your brother was under some kind of pressure," Price persisted. "He wrote in his notebook about enemies, about a burden he was carrying. Do you have any idea what he might have been referring to?" Michael sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Alfred was always involved in some business or another, always making deals and alliances. I didn't pry into his affairs, but I knew that not all of his ventures were above board." "Do you believe one of his enemies then could be responsible for his death?" Price asked. "It's possible," Michael admitted, though there was a trace of doubt in his voice. "Alfred made enemies easily, but I can't say who might have had the means or the motive to kill him. It could have been anyone." Price noted the deflection, the way Michael seemed to distance himself from the possibility that the killer was someone within the family. But there was something about Michael's demeanour that didn't sit right with Price. "Mr. Pembroke," Price said, his tone firm, "if there is anything you're not telling me, Now is the time to speak. Michael met Price's gaze, his eyes cold. I've told you everything I know, Inspector. If you want to find the person responsible for Alfred's death, you'd do better to look outside this family. Price held Michael's gaze for a moment longer, then nodded and rose from his seat. Very well, Mr. Pembroke, but I'll be continuing my investigation, and I may have more questions for you in the future. Michael simply nodded. As Price left the drawing room, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just witnessed a performance, that Michael was playing a role, carefully crafting his responses to deflect suspicion. As he walked, Price decided that it was time to speak with Lady Margaret. She had been a somewhat peripheral figure in the investigation so far, but her connection to Lord Alfred and the changes to the will made her an important figure. Price had noticed the tension between her and Emily, the strained politeness that masked something deeper. It was time to find out what Lady Margaret knew. Price found Lady Margaret in the conservatory, a glass-domed room filled with plants and flowers. She was seated on a wicker chair, a book open on her lap. Her eyes were distant, lost in thought, and she didn't notice Price's approach until he was almost upon her. "Lady Margaret," Price greeted her softly, not wanting to startle her. She looked up, blinking as if coming out of a daze. "Inspector Price," she said, her voice polite but tinged with weariness. "Is there something you need?" "I was hoping we could have a word," Price said, taking a seat across from her. "There are a few matters I'd like to clarify, if you don't mind." Lady Margaret sighed, setting her book aside. "Of course, Inspector. What would you like to know?" "To begin with," Price said, "I understand that Lord Alfred was planning to make changes to his will. Were you aware of this?" Lady Margaret nodded. "He mentioned it to me, yes. He said it was necessary to ensure the estate was properly managed after his passing." "Did he tell you what those changes would be?" Price asked. Lady Margaret hesitated for a moment, then shook her head. "No, he didn't go into detail. Alfred was always very protective of his decisions, especially when it came to the estate. He didn't like to share his plans until they were finalised." "But you had your suspicions?" Price suggested, watching her closely. Lady Margaret sighed, her gaze drifting to the flowers around her. "I knew that Alfred was concerned about the future, about what would happen to Thornfield after he was gone. He wanted to ensure that the estate remained intact, that it didn't fall into the wrong hands." "And did you agree with those changes?" Price asked, his tone gentle but probing. Lady Margaret's expression hardened slightly. "It wasn't my place to agree or disagree, Inspector. Alfred was the head of this family, and it was his decision to make. But I did have concerns about the way he was handling things. He was so determined to control everything, to dictate how the estate would be run even after his death. It caused tension, especially with Michael." Price nodded, sensing the undercurrent of frustration in her words. "There seems to have been quite a bit of tension within the family recently. Emily mentioned that you and Lord Alfred had your differences as well." Lady Margaret looked away, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Alfred and we had our disagreements, yes. But they were nothing more than the usual differences of opinion that occur in any marriage." "But those disagreements never escalated," Price pressed, trying to gauge the depth of their conflict. Lady Margaret shook her head. "No, they didn't. Alfred could be difficult, stubborn even, but he was never unreasonable. He listened to my concerns, even if he didn't always act on them." Price studied her for a moment. "Lady Margaret, do you know anything about a letter that Lord Alfred received the day before his death? It contained a very specific threat." Lady Margaret's eyes widened slightly, genuine surprise flickering across her face. "No, I didn't know about any letter. Alfred didn't mention it to me." "One more thing, Lady Margaret," Price said. "L. Did your husband ever mention feeling threatened or being watched? Did he confide in you about any enemies he might have had?" Lady Margaret shook her head, her brow furrowed in thought. "No, he didn't. Alfred was always very private about his concerns. If he was worried about something, he kept it to himself." Price nodded. "Thank you, Lady Margaret. Your insights have been very helpful." Chapter 8. Beneath the Surface. Price decided to start his day by speaking with the staff. While the family members had their own reasons for being secretive, the servants often saw and heard more than they were given credit for. They were the silent observers of life in the manor, privy to conversations and interactions that the family might not even realize were being witnessed. Mrs. Hudson had been helpful, but Price knew that there were others who might have additional insights. He decided to begin with Thomas, the butler. As the head of the household staff, Thomas had been with the family for many years and was likely to know the dynamics of the house better than anyone. Price found Thomas in the servants' quarters, meticulously polishing the silverware. "Good morning, Inspector," Thomas greeted him with a slight bow. "How can I assist you today?" "Good morning, Thomas," Price replied, taking a seat at the small wooden table in the room. "I'd like to ask you a few questions about the events leading up to Lord Alfred's death. I understand you've been with the family for quite some time." "Yes, Inspector," Thomas replied. "I've served the Pembrokes for nearly 20 years now. I've seen the children grow up, seen the estate change hands, and been witness to more than a few family disputes." "Then you're likely aware of the tensions that existed within the family," Price said, watching Thomas closely. "Particularly between Lord Alfred and his brother Michael." Thomas hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, Inspector." The brothers were often at odds, especially when it came to the management of the estate. Michael always felt that Alfred was too controlling, too unwilling to consider other opinions. "Did you witness any arguments between them recently?" Price asked. "I did," Thomas admitted. "A few days before Lord Alfred's death, the two of them had a particularly heated argument in the study. I could hear raised voices even from outside the room." "Did you hear what the argument was about?" Price pressed. "Not the specifics, Inspector," Thomas replied, "but I did catch a few words. Michael was accusing Lord Alfred of something about a betrayal. It was clear that whatever it was, it had deeply upset Michael." "Betrayal?" Price echoed, his interest piqued. "Did Lord Alfred respond to the accusation?" Thomas shook his head. "I couldn't hear Lord Alfred's response clearly, but he seemed to be trying to calm Michael down, to reason with him. But Michael was too angry to listen." "And what happened after the argument?" Price asked. "Did they part on bad terms?" "They did," Thomas confirmed. Michael stormed out of the study, slamming the door behind him. He didn't speak to Lord Alfred for the rest of the day. It was clear that the argument had left a deep rift between them. "Thomas," Price said, changing the subject slightly, "do you know anything about a letter that Lord Alfred received the day before his death? It contained a threat, but the sender was not identified." Thomas's expression grew serious. "I do remember that letter, Inspector. I was the one who brought it to Lord Alfred. It arrived in the Morning Post, but there was no return address, no indication of who had sent it." "Did you notice anything unusual about the letter?" Price asked. Thomas nodded. "It was unmarked, as you said, and the handwriting on the envelope was unfamiliar. I thought it odd at the time, but Lord Alfred didn't seem concerned. He simply took the letter and dismissed me." "Did he say anything after reading it?" Price inquired. "No, Inspector," Thomas replied, "but I did notice that he seemed unsettled. He went very quiet after reading the letter, and later that day he spent a long time in the study, writing something." "Did Lord Alfred have any visitors that day?" Price asked. "Only one, Inspector," Thomas said. "Mr. Hawthorne, the family solicitor. He came by in the afternoon and they had a lengthy discussion in the study. I wasn't privy to their conversation, but I assume it was related to the changes Lord Alfred was making to his will." Price nodded, the pieces beginning to fit together. It seemed likely that the letter had prompted Lord Alfred to take immediate action regarding his will, possibly in response to the threat it contained. But who had sent the letter, and what were they hoping to achieve? "Thank you, Thomas," Price said, rising to his feet. "You've been very helpful. If you think of anything else, no matter how small, please let me know." "Of course, Inspector," Thomas replied, bowing slightly. "I will keep my ears open." Price decided it was time to speak with Mr. Hawthorne, the family solicitor. If Lord Alfred had made changes to his will in the days leading up to his death, Mr. Hawthorne would be the one to know. The solicitor's office was in the nearby village, a short drive from the manor. Price arranged for a carriage and set off immediately, eager to continue his investigation. The village was small and quaint, with narrow cobblestone streets and ivy-covered cottages. Mr. Hawthorne's office was located in a modest but well-maintained building on the main street. Price was shown into Mr. Hawthorne's office by a young clerk, and the solicitor rose to greet him as he entered. Mr. Hawthorne was a tall, thin man in his early 50s, with sharp features and an air of quiet authority. He gestured for Price to take a seat, then settled into his own chair behind a large mahogany desk. "Inspector Price," Mr. Hawthorne began, his tone polite but reserved. "How can I assist you today?" "Thank you for seeing me on such short notice, Mr. Hawthorne," Price replied, sitting down. "I'm here to ask you about Lord Alfred Pemrboke and the changes he was making to his will shortly before his death." Mr. Hawthorne's expression grew serious. "Yes, Lord Alfred did make some amendments to his will in the days leading up to his passing. It was a matter of great importance to him, though he did not share the specifics with me until the day before he died." "Can you tell me what those amendments were?" Price asked. "I'm afraid I'm bound by confidentiality, Inspector," Mr. Hawthorne said, his tone cautious. "However, given the circumstances, I can tell you that Lord Alfred was primarily concerned with the future of Thornfield Manor and ensuring its continued prosperity. He wanted to make sure that the estate was managed by someone he trusted implicitly." "Was that person Michael Pembroke?" Price asked, suspecting the answer. Mr. Hawthorne hesitated, then shook his head. "No, Inspector. Lord Alfred had become increasingly disillusioned with Michael's handling of certain matters related to the estate. The changes he was making were designed to limit Michael's influence and ensure that the estate would be protected in the event of his passing." "Did Lord Alfred mention who he intended to take over the management of the estate?" Price asked. "He did," Mr. Hawthorne replied, his expression grave. "Lord Alfred intended to leave the estate in the hands of his daughter Emily. He believed she had the temperament and the skills necessary to manage Thornfield effectively." Price nodded, absorbing this new information. The decision to pass over Michael in favour of Emily would have been a significant blow to Michael's ambitions, and might explain the heated argument between the brothers. "Did Lord Alfred express any concerns about his safety or mention receiving any threats?" Price asked, turning the conversation to the mysterious letter. Mr. Hawthorne looked slightly puzzled. "No, Inspector. He didn't mention any threats to me, but he did seem unusually anxious during our last meeting. I assumed it was simply the stress of making such important decisions, but now—" "Now you think it might have been something more," Price finished for him. Mr. Hawthorne nodded slowly. "Yes, Inspector. In light of what has happened, I believe Lord Alfred was more troubled than he let on. He was a proud man, not one to admit to fear easily, but I sensed that he was wrestling with something in those final days." "Thank you, Mr. Hawthorne," Price said, rising to his feet. "You've been very helpful. If I have any further questions, I'll be sure to contact you." "Of course, Inspector," Mr. Hawthorne replied, standing as well. "I wish you the best of luck in your investigation. I hope you find the answers you're looking for." Chapter 9. The Secrets We Keep. Inspector Price returned to Thornfield Manor in the late afternoon.
His conversation with Mr. Hawthorne had confirmed many of his suspicions, but it had also raised new questions. The decision to bypass Michael and entrust the estate to Emily was a significant one that would have undoubtedly caused friction. But was it enough to drive someone to murder? And who had sent the threatening letter that had so unsettled Lord Alfred in his final days?
As Price pondered these questions, he found himself drawn to the library. The room was empty, the heavy curtains drawn back to allow the fading daylight to filter through the tall windows. Price walked slowly along the shelves, his eyes scanning the titles as he considered his next steps. There was something about the library that felt significant, as if it held the answers he was seeking. It was a place of knowledge, of history, and it had been one of Lord Alfred's favourite rooms in the manor. As he reached the far end of the room, Price noticed a small, leather-bound journal lying on one of the side tables. It was slightly worn, the pages yellowed with age, but it was unmistakably well cared for. The journal appeared to be out of place, as if someone had recently been reading it and then forgotten to put it away. Price picked up the journal and opened it, the faint scent of ink and parchment rising from the pages. It was Lord Alfred's handwriting, neat and precise, detailing his thoughts and observations in the weeks leading up to his death. Price began to read. The first few entries were mundane, detailing Lord Alfred's daily routines and thoughts on the management of the estate. But as Price turned the pages, he began to notice a shift in tone. The entries grew more introspective, more troubled, as if Lord Alfred had been wrestling with some inner turmoil. One entry in particular caught Price's attention. Dated a week before Lord Alfred's death, it read, "I've been feeling increasingly uneasy these past few days. The weight of the decisions I've made regarding the estate is pressing heavily upon me. Michael's anger is palpable, and I fear that I have driven a wedge between us that cannot be mended. But what choice did I have? I could not, in good conscience, leave the future of Thornfield in hands that I do not trust. Emily is young, but she is capable, and I believe she will grow into the role. Yet I worry about the repercussions of my actions. The letter I received this morning has only deepened my sense of foreboding. It was unsigned, but the threat was clear. I must tread carefully, for I fear that I have made an enemy I do not fully understand." The journal confirmed what he had already suspected, that Lord Alfred had been deeply concerned about the consequences of his decisions. The mention of the letter was particularly telling, as it suggested that the threat had been weighing heavily on his mind. Turning the page, Price found another entry, this one written 2 days later. "I've been avoiding Michael since our argument. The look in his eyes when I told him of my decision haunts me. I never intended to hurt him, but I could see the betrayal etched into his face. He feels that I have robbed him of his birthright, and perhaps in a way I have. Emily has been a comfort to me in these difficult times, though she does not fully understand the gravity of the situation. I have not told her everything. I cannot burden her with my fears. But I wonder if I should have confided in someone, if perhaps, by keeping these worries to myself, I have made a grave error. The letter. I cannot shake the feeling that it is connected to all of this. I have considered going to the authorities, but what would I tell them? That I received a vague threat? That I am being haunted by my own conscience? No, I must handle this on my own. But the weight is growing heavier, and I fear I am not as strong as I once was." The entries ended there, the final pages of the journal blank. Price closed the book slowly, his thoughts churning. Price slipped the journal into his coat pocket, knowing that it could serve as important evidence. He left the library and made his way through the dimly lit corridors of the manor. Chapter 10. The Truth Revealed. The afternoon sun cast a warm glow over Thornfield Manor as Inspector Price prepared for his final confrontation. He had requested Mr. Hawthorne to meet him in the study, the very room where the solicitor had seemed so uneasy about the recent changes to Lord Alfred's will. Price felt a mixture of anticipation and apprehension as he reviewed his notes, the evidence finally converging on a single suspect. Mr. Hawthorne arrived promptly, his demeanour calm but his eyes betraying a hint of nervousness. He greeted Price with a polite nod before taking a seat across from him. "Inspector," Hawthorne said, settling into the armchair, "I assume you have some new developments to discuss." "Yes, Mr. Hawthorne," Price replied, leaning forward. "I've been reviewing all the evidence and speaking with the family. There's something I need to clarify with you regarding Lord Alfred's will and the recent changes made to it." Hawthorne's expression remained composed, but a flicker of unease crossed his features. "I'm listening, Inspector." "Miss Pembrooke mentioned that you were particularly agitated about the changes to the will," Price began, his tone measured. "You expressed concerns about how it might affect the estate and its management." Hawthorne nodded. "Indeed, I was concerned. Any significant change in the will, especially one that affects the estate's future, can lead to complications. It's part of my job to ensure that all legal matters are handled smoothly." Price studied him intently. Your agitation went beyond professional concern, Mr. Hawthorne. I found that you had a personal stake in these changes. You were aware of the threats Lord Alfred had been receiving, and your reaction to them was more than just a lawyer's concern. Hawthorne's face turned pale, and he shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I assure you, Inspector, my primary concern was always the proper handling of the estate. Perhaps, Price said, his voice firm. But I have reason to believe that your concerns were driven by more than just professional duty. The threatening letter, the arguments about the will, and your increasing agitation point to a deeper involvement. Hawthorne swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. What are you suggesting? Mr. Hawthorne, Price continued, I've uncovered evidence that points to you as the person who sent the threatening letter. The letter was written in a manner that reflects a deep-seated resentment that aligns with your feelings toward the changes in the will. And it seems that your agitation was not just about the estate, but about the potential loss of your influence and financial gain. Hawthorne's facade of composure began to crumble. He looked down at his hands, his fingers trembling. I didn't mean to... Didn't mean to what? Price pressed, his voice hardening. Didn't mean to threaten Lord Alfred? Or didn't mean to go further and commit murder when your threats were ignored? Hawthorne's face contorted in anguish. I was desperate. The changes to the will would have left me with nothing. My position, my influence, all at risk. Lord Alfred was making decisions that could ruin me. I felt cornered. Price's eyes narrowed. So you decided to take matters into your own hands. You sent the letter to scare Lord Alfred, hoping he would reconsider his decision. But when he didn't, you saw no other option but to act. Hawthorne nodded, tears welling in his eyes. I never intended to kill him. I just wanted him to understand the severity of the situation. But when he ignored the letter and continued with his plans, I felt my whole world slipping away. He wanted Emily to have full control and cut me off from the will like a piece of garbage. Price's expression softened slightly, though his resolve remained unshaken. Your actions had dire consequences, Mr. Hawthorne. The murder of Lord Alfred was the result of your inability to accept the changes and the desperation to cling to your former power. I didn't think it would come to this, Hawthorne said, his voice breaking. I'm so sorry. I never wanted anyone to die. You'll need to come with me, Price said, standing up. We'll have to make a formal statement and prepare for the legal proceedings. As Price escorted Hawthorne out of the study, he glanced around the manor, reflecting on the events that had transpired. The estate would eventually heal from the wounds inflicted by this tragedy, but the scars would remain.